Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. My guest is Russ Curtis. He is the communications lead with International Bird Rescue. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having us, Nancy.
Your organization was founded over 50 years ago when there was a horrible oil spill of 800,000 gallons of oil into the ocean, into San Francisco Bay in January 1971. What happened back then? And I know that most environmentalists, conservationists, wildlife experts had no idea how to even clean up the birds at that time.
Well, you're exactly right. That was a horrific spill of almost 1 million gallons of oil. It happened just near the Golden Gate Bridge in 71. It included two Standard Oil tankers that collided in the fog. Standard Oil, of course, now is Chevron. What actually ended up happening is this oil not only stained the shoreline inside the bay, which is a huge, estuary, basically, but it also pushed out through the Golden Gate and ended up oiling beaches north and south, and thousands of birds were caught up in this slick. There really wasn't any sort of organized wildlife care for oiled birds and other wildlife back then. This is 1971, just a year after Earth Day started, and if you remember right, in 1969 there was a huge spill in Santa Barbara, California. So some volunteers got together and opened up quickly as many oil spill kind of like wildlife rehabilitation centers. From our instance, the founder of our organization, Alice Berkner, was a nurse at the time, and she got along with some other volunteers and other nurses and set up a center that became kind of the hub of taking care of birds. Now, back then, nobody really had an idea how to properly take care of these birds after they've been oiled. They just sort of threw themselves into this, taking in as many birds as they could. And it was a pretty horrific sight, I think, for most people, because you've got these birds that are completely oiled. We have a picture on our website of a surf scoter, which is a sea duck. And it just looks like somebody just poured a can of black grease over the whole bird. That's what they encountered, and they had to sort of pull themselves together to figure out first how to sort of stabilize the birds and feed them. That people had a pretty good understanding of. There was enough people working in wildlife, and birds came into other wildlife centers over the years and around San Francisco Bay. But dealing with the oil spill was something new, and I think it took Alice and some really dedicated people to help figure that out. And they sorted things out. They were able to clean birds, but they really didn't have the experience or the background to know what's the best way to do that. And so over the last 50 years, we've actually been able to learn from over 200 spills that we've been involved in, including working on the Exxon Valdez and down in the Gulf's 2010 spill.
You have done incredible work with over 31,000 volunteer hours. You've treated over 3,500 wildlife annually. But that first spill, you ended up forming the International Bird Rescue Research Center, now called International Bird Rescue. But sadly, over 7,000 birds were affected, and you could only collect about 4,300 of them, and actually only about 300 were successfully rehabilitated and released. That's not great numbers, but some.
Yeah, well, and I think that showed us pretty quickly that we needed to figure out how to better treat birds, and there's many organizations all over the world doing this sort of work. But to see what was happening, we realized that we needed to really be organized in future spills, because oil was everywhere, and it continues to be transported in various places all over the world. And now you have rail and you have pipeline.
I would hope that the oil companies that are transporting the oil and are responsible for these collisions, these spills, these leaks, would totally invest invest in the nonprofit organizations that are doing the work and hopefully not totally depend on volunteers to do the work.
The Exxon Valdez spill, where there was 11 million gallons spilled, 11 million. Just think about the numbers in Prince William Sound. And we had our response team up there for 6 months during that spill in 1989. But following that, Congress really started to act and put in some pollution control standards that led to the oil companies being required to not only have contingency plans, which included cleanup and response, but also wildlife management. And that's where we came in, is after that we've actually connected with a number of oil companies and with companies that service this industry, especially in Alaska, where we have contracts with companies where we do trainings and we prepare them for the inevitable issue of a catastrophic oil spill.
It's important to be in cooperative situations, and your organization, International Bird Rescue, is a founding partner in the state of California's Oiled Wildlife Care Network, hosted by the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California at Davis, as well as the Global Oiled Wildlife Response System, a consortium of leading experts trying to solve these challenges of oiled wildlife outside of your current geography and area. How many different groups are there, both in the state of California and around the world?
Oh, there's got to be hundreds now. We've been always in the belief that we needed to share the information we learned on our spills. It's given us a great way to connect not only to folks like in South America. There's another organization that's similar to ours in the Brazil and Argentina area, because there's a lot of oil exploration down there, and they've been able to learn from us. One of the bright, shining parts of our work is collaboration with a group in South Africa and Cape Town, where the African penguin, which is now endangered, has been really pummeled by oil spills over the years, and also bycatch and the climate change going on down there. But back in 2000, we were able to help them and collaborate with them on rescuing 20,000 penguins that had been oiled. We released, with Sandcob's help, that's a South African group that works down there, we were able to release almost 93% of the birds that came in. And penguins are a pretty hardy bunch, but I think it underscores when you can work together internationally and collaboratively with other groups, you can get a lot done. Thankfully, oil spills are actually down. We don't have as many in sheer numbers as we did, it seems like, even 10 or 15 years ago.
I would hope that they would have more precautions and safety features established at this point.
They do, but there's always the likelihood that humans are not imperfect, and I think we've seen places that they've not always made the right decision, or there's some sort of failure in their process and oil escapes.
I know that if I step in a glob of oil or get some oil on me, it's a mess to clean up and difficult, and we don't like it on our skin or our clothing, and obviously wildlife doesn't like it. How do you get the oil off of these birds? Have you learned that there's a certain chemical, hopefully not, or just good old soap and water?
Yeah, well, I think over the years we've learned that there's just not one thing that can clean the birds. First of all, we don't clean them right away. We always stabilize them, and we make sure that they're in a quiet, safe space, and they get fluids, and they kind of rebuild a little bit of their stuff so they can get washed. Because washing a bird is stressful. The washing is really, it's a combination of Dawn dishwashing liquid and other suffocants that can remove the oil without damaging the feathers or damaging their skin. That's the most important thing below the feather line. We've also learned that you can use baking soda and even white vinegar, but over the years we've learned that tried and true dishwashing liquid of Dawn does the trick, and we've kept that. We were using it before Dawn actually started donating it to us. We used it for about 20 years until they found out that we were using it successfully with birds.
It's interesting that particular combination of ingredients in that dishwashing detergent works so well. After you clean the birds, how long do you watch them before you say fly away and get back to your home?
It depends on the bird. It also depends on the severity of the oil, how long they were oiled, how much oil they had on them. Some oil, depending on the quality of it, may burn the bird a little bit. A water bird is supposed to be in the water. If it's been sitting down on the beach or on a rock, it may have keel sores. because of the oil, they may be out of the water, they may be cold and freezing. If we can get them quickly, oftentimes within a week or two, we can get them back into the wild. But we've had a number of birds that have stayed with us for months just to get them back to a point where their blood values are good and they're healthy and they've eaten, and then we can re-release them.
Your organization has saved a lot of birds. Is there one that responds better to your treatment and to getting cleaned up? And is there another bird species that just finds it too difficult to recover from being caught in an oil spill?
Oh, good question. A number of species do really well. I'd say the experience we had with the African penguins in South Africa, I loosely call these the Cadillac of seabirds because they're remarkable in the ability to recover from an oiling. Pelicans typically do pretty well if we can get them in quickly. Birds that have a lot of mass already and can survive out in cold climates because their sort of ability to thermoregulate has been compromised by the oil do better. Over the years, we've learned that loons, the birds that make that mournful cry, they are difficult to rehabilitate and care. They're very stressed birds in general.
What about the western grebes and the surf scooters?
The western grebe does pretty well. In fact, we get a number of them from Southern California. If you've ever walked the beaches along Ventura and Santa Barbara, there's always a little bit of tar on the sand, and you'll come home and have to clean the bottoms of your feet. Well, that's part of a natural seep that's pretty evident in the waters off Ventura and Santa Barbara County. Western grebes really love that area. They tend to spend a lot of time in the water right at near the surf's edge. We get a lot of those in at our Los Angeles Center, which is in San Pedro. They do come in with, they're oiled, they're cold, they're hungry. They typically have been, a lot of them end up on the beach. So if we're lucky to actually get them rescued and get them into care, they do pretty well.
Obviously, people become specialists in wildlife rescue, and you have focused on birds. But let's face it, when there's an oil spill, there are other animals out there in the ocean. Sea mammals, fish, all sorts of different creatures. Is there a rescue group for all the different kinds of animals and even the plants that need to be cleaned?
Yeah, in California, we're lucky to have the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, which is a network of wildlife organizations, everything from folks working with birds like we do, but also mammals, like at the Marine Mammal Center up here in San Francisco Bay, and also places that deal with bigger mammals or even sea otters. There's actually a response center in Santa Cruz because there's so many sea otters in the Monterey Bay. So I think working with seabirds has given us a pretty good idea of how they react to being in a stress-free environment. And these other organizations that deal with other wildlife in the ocean have learned from us as well, and we learn from them. We actually have over the years come into contact on some of our spills, reptiles and beavers and other things that have been oiled maybe out in an estuary.
We've been talking about your rescuing and cleaning up and rehabilitating and releasing birds caught in oil spills. But birds can be caught in boat engines. Birds can have other disasters affect them with broken bones. What other kinds of rescues do you have to cope with?
Our biggest issue day to day is birds that come in with fishing line and tackle injuries. I would especially say brown pelicans, which are such a great, majestic bird that frequents the West Coast, that we get a lot of birds in that have had a fishing line wrapped around their bill, they're strangling themselves in their neck area, or they've had some sort of slashed pouch because they've gotten some part of a hook or some part of a tackle thing injury. It's something that we always encourage the public to keep an eye out for. Those birds need to get into care just as much as an oiled animal. If they've got some sort of slash pouch, it's hard for them to feed, and they will spend more time worried about that injury than they will actually going out and foraging for food. We also encourage the public to keep an eye out on the beaches, that if they see some sort of fishing line and tackle, pick it up and dispose of it and give the birds a break. It's tough sort of like sharing the space, I think, with humans, because humans typically kind of leave a mess. If you've ever been to the beach after like 4th of July, it's kind of a scattering of trash and things like that. And I think we can all do a better job of sort of sharing the wildlife space with them. Over the years, going back into the 70s when we were founded, pelicans were really having a hard time. And one of the reasons the pelican is part of our logo is that back in the 70s, there was a thing called DDT that was actually leaching into the environment and affecting the ability for pelicans to reproduce.
But we still have pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and other chemicals going into the waters and affecting the birds and the other animals, even if it's not DDT.
That's true. We have enough runoff of just oil in the street and the pollution from thousands or millions of people living in an area that ends up in the ocean or in estuaries. That does affect the quality of the water, and it affects the birds' ability to thrive.
In fact, sewage is still sometimes going into waters raw. And doesn't that affect the birds, or are they eating it and find it to be food?
The thing that really we've noticed over the years that has been a concern and has affected birds, even neurologically, is there's been more red tides or tides that involve some sort of domoic acid, and that's a sort of a collection of toxins that is sort of built up in the water. Either the water's gotten too warm, or there's a combination of chemicals and things that are happening even in Monterey Bay, where it's a beautiful bay, but we've actually had instances where birds have come in from that area with neurological problems because domoic acid has sort of like choked out the fish. In some ways, it's affected the fish that the pelicans are eating and other birds. Luckily, if we get the birds in quickly enough, we can actually sort of flush that domoic acid out of their system. But you're right, there are other pollutants that are always presenting challenges to wildlife, especially in the ocean now.
We're going to talk more about rescuing birds and oil spills and how they affect wildlife when we return in a moment with my guest, Russ Curtis, with the International Bird Rescue Organization.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Russ Curtis, who is the communications lead with International Bird Rescue. Because you're based in San Francisco, you have a facility in Los Angeles, you have been focusing on water birds. But don't we have to rescue birds even when they're not near the water? Aren't they running into troubles too?
They are. The focus on water birds, of course, for us has just been our passion, and that's where the need seems to be. One of the things that we are having more ducklings and other birds come in that obviously are water birds, but they're being crowded out because of just the amount of area that's been taken over by housing and development, where it's squeezed a lot of these bird species out.
Most of the oil spills that we've been talking about are near our coastline, but ships go across the oceans, and I'm sure that they have some oil leaks and so forth. Is anybody doing anything with the birds that do migrate across the oceans, the birds that are farther away from the coastline? And what about the birds that are being affected near coastlines with countries that don't have the response teams that you have?
That is a really big concern of ours, especially in these developing areas of oil exploration in countries that don't have an infrastructure to deal with. And we've reached out, I think, with the global partners. We've had to sort of offer not only training for people in those countries to be better prepared in the event of a spill, but I think the bigger concern that we have, this is borne out with our visits to places like Midway Atoll, where there's thousands and thousands of albatrosses actually coming back every year to procreate and build nests and raise their young. But this is an area where Midway is halfway between Japan and the United States. But it's also a place where huge amounts of plastic sort of gather and wash up on shores of these islands. These are the northern chain of the Hawaiian Islands. And I think the bigger concern is how the plastics have entered into the ecosystem and are showing up in bird stomachs, and just the food that they've eaten and they've gotten used to picking working through plastics. When you see that sort of pictures of birds that have died and then seen their stomachs open up, and you're like, wow, we've got a real issue with plastics. And of course, they're all sort of connected in some ways. It's a petroleum product. But the plastics washing up on our shores now, I think, is even a greater concern.
Indeed, plastics all over the world, whether or not it's the oceans or even the deserts where camels are being found eating plastics and having it in their stomachs, is a real concern. We know that these birds that live in the ocean islands and traverse the oceans are definitely having to deal with these new problems as well as the traditional spill problems that we've been talking about. Your organization started with an oil spill, cleaning up some birds. Are you optimistic that there'll be fewer and fewer spills and that your work will be not as necessary, but just there in case there's an emergency?
I think we're hopeful that we're being more careful, especially with transporting oil across the oceans. There's been better controls, and I think the bigger concern for us longer term is as the switch to exploration, especially in the United States, where it's more based in North America, the movement in oil now is switched into rail car and pipelines. And I always remind people that if you were to look at a map of even California, there is already a huge pipeline. If you look at it, it looks like a spaghetti factory. There's pipelines all over California. We're moving oil constantly. In fact, some of, not the biggest spills, but the most ornery spills recently have been pipeline breaks. There have been some in Southern California. There's been, over the years, there have been some in Northern California. These pipelines usually, they're affecting not always waterbirds, but other animals in canyons and terrestrial areas. So I think long-term, the worry and the preparation that I know the Oil Wildlife Care Network is doing is concentrating on inland spills because oil's moving across on rail. And as we've seen, there's been more pipelines, and there's this tremendous worry that those might be the worst scenarios down the road.
You've been rescuing birds for many years. What kind of statistics are there in terms of the number of species, the number of individuals, the number of conditions, the number of spills? Who's maintaining what kind of record of what the situation has been and is and might be?
For us, we keep records of our spill responses. What we focused in on is bird band returns. We band each bird with a metal federal band, and we get reports that not only surprise us, but also humble us in our efforts. In particular, we had a bird from a spill in 1996 that was a king eider, which is a big sea duck in Alaska that we rescued that was oiled. We returned it to the wild, and 23 years later, we just found out we had the bird band return. So it lived a long life after being rehabilitated, and that to us is sort of the greatest return that we get.
That is great news to know that by cleaning them up and releasing them, that they can have a long life after having had a terrible situation being oiled.
Yeah, it's true, and when we let the public know about that, I think it surprises them, but it also makes them feel that this work we do is pretty important.
How many water birds are there that you've cleaned up? How many species?
Oh, there must be hundreds. The biggest numbers for us typically are in the pelican, common murre, which looks like a little bit of a penguin. It's a black and white bird that nests along the coast of the West Coast. Grebes are a big one. You know, we probably have about 20 species that are sort of in our top ones, but we've dealt with just about every species of water bird, I think, that is prevalent on the West Coast, everything from Alaska all the way down to Mexico.
If we go to the website, do we see the before and after pictures?
You will. If your listeners would like to learn more about bird rescue, they're welcome to check out our website. It's called birdrescue.org. We are also having a 50th anniversary celebration on May 15th. We're doing a virtual event at that point, and we hope to have an in-person event in October, which would involve a big music festival.
What kind of research is necessary? What should scientists be finding out? You already know how to clean up birds if they've been covered in oil. What more do we need to know?
One of the things that we continue to do research on is how well we can treat birds in care, whether or not if we sedate them, will they actually actually do better in a stressful environment where they're being washed, depending on the species. So we've looked at other elements of bird care, but also what seems to work as far as feeding and cleaning and the amount of time spent between getting the bird in care and how long you need to wait before you can actually get it into a wash. The other thing that I think came up in our research, and this is just day-to-day figuring things out, is that initially when birds came in, they would oftentimes just sit on substrate that was too hard really for their keels, and their keels are used to being in water where it's buoyant. We came up with this idea that we could make a net bottom area for them to sit, which allowed them to sort of still move around but didn't create this pressure right on their keel, which is their breastbone. And just by sort of observing that and making changes in the ability to house the birds, we were able to not only share that research, but make changes in the way other organizations deal with birds. And we share this information freely at a lot of different wildlife conferences, but also on our website through some of the research papers that we've contributed.
You mentioned that another threat to birds, aside from oil spills, is getting entangled in fishing nets and lines. Is the fishing industry, the seafood industry, involved with bird rescue? Do they care about the wildlife as well as just catching the fish to sell in the market?
Individually, I think fishermen have helped us and contributed to educating the public around this. We've actually sort of worked together with a group that actually does these collection things on piers, especially for anglers that are just pier fishermen, to sort of like clean up after themselves. So we've done some education with them. We're always trying to educate the public. One of the ways that we've done that is we now blue band all our brown pelicans that go out, and we've been doing this now since 2009, and we've banded probably close to 1,500 brown pelicans on the California coast. With the help of citizen scientists, they've been able to spot these birds because they have big blue plastic bands on their legs along with the federal band, and that gives us great response, not only from the public, but it gives us the ability to know that these birds are doing well in the wild. In fact, we just had a report of a bird that had been released in 2009, and 11, 12 years later, it's still out and was found on a nest in the Channel Islands. That's another indication that our work is proceeding, but also we're relying more on the public to help us spread the word and report those. And so if folks do find or see a blue-banded pelican out while they're on the water someplace or at the beach, see a blue band, we encourage them to report it.
You've had a lot of success with the pelican. Is there a bird species that you wish you would have more success with and just doesn't do well in recovery?
Well, I talked about the common loon. I think the loons are particularly stressful. We've gotten a lot better at treating them, but they're just generally a very stressful bird. But there's just some species that they're just not that robust at recovering from human interaction and some sort of injury.
Are most of the species that you have rescued doing okay in numbers, or do you run into some rare and endangered species that are very low in numbers and it's really super critical that we do rescue them and rehabilitate them and return them to the wild?
Yeah, I think birds like the snowy plover, we've had these tiny shorebirds that more and more human encroachment on their space has their numbers have gone down. There's been other organizations that are actually watching those in the public space. But those shorebirds are really having a tough time, I think, just because there's so many more people on this earth and there's less space for them to not only to live, but also to nest without being disturbed.
Since the shorebirds need the beaches, and humans want the beaches, and humans have been developing the beaches and are recreating at the beaches. Are you working to try and set aside areas where it's for the birds and not for the humans?
The great thing is that a lot of our partners and folks that we work alongside with, especially like the Audubon groups, have done a really good job of helping protect certain areas. And there's been some really great set-asides. I think even the public has realized we need to support setting aside great swaths of estuary areas. Think of Bolsa Chica down in Seal Beach area, where there's just teeming with bird life.
Even though you're based in California, you have an Alaska Response Center?
That's true. In addition to our two California wildlife centers, one in Northern California, one in Southern California, we have in Anchorage, Alaska, an Alaska Response Center. It's a turnkey center that is set just in case there's an oil spill, we don't have to go set something up at the last minute, which oftentimes get it set up correctly would take weeks. With the response of and support of the oil industry in Alaska, we've been able to not only maintain, but have a response center that we can walk in, turn the lights on, turn the water on, and get everything up and running within a couple hours.
So important to be prepared. I am so pleased that you and your volunteers are there to care and rescue our wildlife, especially our birds. I want to thank you so very much for all the good work that you're doing and have been doing, and I want to thank you for being my guest.
Thank you for having us.
I have been speaking with Russ Curtis, Communications Lead with International Bird Rescue. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.